Dear students, today we shall look into the poem Anniversaries of War. This session is part 1, and through this session, I intend to give you a background to the poet Yehuda Amichai and the Palmach generation. The analysis of the poem is discussed in Anniversaries of War, part 2. Yehuda Amichai is an Israeli modernist poet. He is considered as the first poet to compose in colloquial Hebrew language, and he is considered as a major poet of the Palmach generation. He is most widely translated Hebrew poet since King David, the psalmist you can see in the Bible, and he is widely considered the greatest Jewish poet after Paul Celan. Yehuda Amichai was born on May 3, 1924 in Würzburg, southern Germany. His German name was Ludwig Pfoffer. He attended German Jewish State School, which fostered bilingual and bicultural education. This fact allowed him at an early age to engage in textual study of Hebrew, which he would pursue and deepen even after he renounced religious life as an adult. His father, Frederick, was a notions merchant. The father's love is one of the strongest sources of inspiration for Amichai's poetry and a central motive in his work. In 1936, the family migrated to Palestine when the Nazis came to power. He began to use his Hebrew given name, Yehuda, after he exiled into Palestine. His education continued to be Orthodox. By the time he volunteered for the Jewish Brigade of British Army in 1942 in order to join the fight against fascism, he had become thoroughly secular. Being a secular, however, never involved for Amichai an anti-religious stance. It was clericalism and the political trade and the sacred, not textual or even ritualistic traditions themselves, that elicited his most sarcastic critique. He Hebraized his last name Amichai, which means my folk lives, when he entered the academic profession. This choice unmistakably asserted both his own Jewishness and the survival of his people or folk as distinct from the nation. He participated in several wars, including the 1948 Arab Israel War, 1956 and 1973 wars. These war experiences shaped him just as much as his father's love did. In the later years, he became an anti-war poet, a poet who would systematically refuse the notion of a meaningful and redemptive war. In 1949, immediately after he retired from wars, he married Tamar Horn. They had a son but separated in early 1960s. In 1952, he started his studies of Hebrew literature and Bible at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He deepened his erudition in Hebrew and world literature. It was then he fell in love with the medieval Hebrew poetry from Spain. During it was the golden age of Hebrew Arabic poetic coexistence. He started modeling his own quatrains on the Persian and Arabic traditions of Rubaiyat. He was particularly fascinated by the work and life of 11th century poet Shmuel HaNagrid, whose influence he freely acknowledges. He was fascinated with the latter's forthright and blunt encounter with the real. Nagrid's poems revolves around the world of quotidian reality, the way the oral Torah revolves around the biblical verse. Hannah offered a model for textualizing and thus sanctifying the mundane. Yehuda Amichai started his professional life as an elementary and high school teacher and moved on to teach both overseas students and prospective teachers at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Over the years, he held various visiting lectureships in graduate Hebrew literature and creative writing programs at major American universities, from New York University to the University in California, Berkeley in the late 1970s. In between, he published his books of poetry. The first book of poetry won the Slonsky Prize in 1957. The second book of poetry, Two Hopes Apart, established him as a major poet of the Palmac generation. He won several awards, and among them in 1982 the prestigious Israel Prize, the country's highest honor for poetry. However, he never privileged writing poetry as real work. It was also an integral part of his poetics, a principal refusal to privilege poetry and the poet, and an ethical commitment to foreground the daily struggles of workaday human beings. From 1964 till his death in 2000, Yehuda Amichai's life partner was Hannah Sokolov. The couple had two children, a son and a daughter. There are numerous poems expressing romantic or paternal love, usually in the shadow of history, war, or death, even when the tone appears playful and witty, a shadow that makes the love in this poem all the more poignant. Love is the material that holds everything together, the glue, he said in an interview with an author Chana. I have never written a war poem that does not mention love in it, and I have never written a love poem without an echo of war, Amichai said in the same interview. Throughout his poetry, the lovers and in the later poetry, the children as well, are described as always in the hazardous in between space surrounded by the threatening forces of death and war. His poetry is mostly autobiographical. He writes about many life events, but the personal often serves as opening narrative, which functions as an impulse for writing poetry and moves on to poetic, metaphorical elaboration and far ranging philosophical meditation. The Palmac generation. The Palmac was the elite fighting force of the Haganah, that is, the underground army of Jewish community. It was established on 15th May 1941. They contributed significantly to Israeli culture and ethos, well beyond its military contribution. Its members formed the backbone of Israel Defense Forces. Yehuda Amichai was one among the many cultural leaders that rose from the Palmac generation. What made them different is the stylistic experimentation they brought to poetry and prose, and also some of the characteristics of the Palmac generation are the writer's response to the establishment of Israel and its post-war of independence stabilization, and questioning of religious, ideological, and cultural absolutes that had formed a sustaining frame for their literary predecessors. According to the poet Aim Hillel, they were born They were a group of poets who were born between 1915 and 1913. All of them immigrated to Palestine. All of them learned Hebrew, joined youth movements, joined army, and distinguished themselves in the War of Independence. They are the first generation to have Hebrew as their mother tongue, and they are the first generation to have grown up within the Israeli landscape. Many of them suffered deep and disturbing sense of historical discontinuity owing to the exilic past. In the 1950s, there was a social and political disillusionment which reflected in poetry also. The Israeli poets were engaged in an introspective preoccupation with the individual's diminishing faith in traditional absolutes or values. They had fought for an ideal society based on an agrarian life, but what materialized was an urbanized, materialistic bourgeoisie society. Moreover, the Israeli society had no continuous stable settlement due to internal strife and war. The poet's social and traditional identity were the two pillars of crisis because there was a modification for the sense of we or oneness in Israel past 1948. In 1948, they had won victory for the state of Israel, and after that, a change happened. Before that, what held them together was the oneness or the literature of the Jewish community. After they settled as a nation, a lot of disintegration happened in the community. Once political freedom had been achieved, the idea of collective group began to diminish. That is, the oneness among them. We are a group, we are a race, we are the chosen race, etc. That began to disintegrate. Moreover, the new generation of younger writers emerged whose social identity and ideology differed largely from the Palmac generation. This breakdown in communal feeling resulted in existential poetry of wandering and homelessness. Another reason for existential crisis was the conscious severance of spiritual identification with the diasporan Judaism. That is, they began to consciously neglect the spiritual background and beliefs of Judaism and began to write secular literature with the Hebrew language. All these developments reflected in a critical attitude towards Jewish diaspora. In the literature, a change happened to represent the writer's lived reality, but they adapted the linguistic aspects of Hebrew, its massive collections of allusions and imagery, its linguistic and thematic varieties, etc. Thus, a Hebrew literature witnessed modernization. In Amichai's poetry, the main theme is the growth of individualism and the loss of cultural past, and a widespread sense of disillusionment characterizes his voice. Some other themes that can be found in Amichai's poetry are the unique view of life, love, individuals' relationship with God, the loss of metaphysical definitions, and the theme of quest, which questions all these facts of life, etc. The analysis of the poem can be found in the second part of this presentation. I have attached it along with this presentation. Please feel free to contact me if you have any doubts. Thank you.